Welcome, and there's a lot of you in here. How do they fit all of you back there? It's really nice to see all of you, and I really want to welcome you today. And not just for some of you knowing me from the past to hear me talk, but it's more that this get-together, this gathering, allows a certain type of dialogue, which I think is necessary in the church in this time. And to be honest, I usually would say no to doing something like this. It's not natural to me to get up in front of people and speak, even though I have been doing that as a teacher. I got a little nervous, to be honest. But Sarah, I don't know if you know Sarah. She's very persuasive. So she was smart. She was tactical. She asked me in July? Was it July? Yeah, when I'm off, when I'm not teaching. See? Very smart. So I agreed. But the real reason I did agree was because my wife Sam let me out on a weeknight. But she did chaperone me today, so thank you. And actually, no, I'm just joking. She laughed at me at first when I spoke about the topic, God in a bar. She giggled and she said, "You in a bar? You don't go to bars." It's because I'm not allowed. I'm just teasing there too. To be honest, the longer that I'm married, and now with the child, the older I get, I begin to see how your focus changes, right? As you get older, at different stages in your life, you don't end up getting them to do this kind of thing that often. So it's a great novelty. So when Sarah said God in a bar, and I agreed, after a couple months getting prepared for the talk, I'm like, God in a bar? What's the real question here? Is it, how do I find God at the bar? Guess you can find anything when you're drunk. Or God in a bar, as if it wasn't possible to find God in a bar, or simply, how did I, personally, me, Phil, find God in a bar? Which is kind of a long story, but I'm not going to speak too much today about the whole topic, which is a relevant topic today of evangelization. I know that there's far more experienced people with a lot of background in that, even present here, so I'll leave that to the expert. But what I was going to discuss is just really two things that I have experienced and learned in my own journey that I wanted to share. And one is simply that God has a plan for your life, and for my life, and for each person, and each person has a story. And the second, echoing John Paul II's words, which has always stayed true to my heart and kind of propelled me forward and propels me forward as I move along through life, is don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. But I've added a caveat to that is, but be cautious. Don't be afraid, but be cautious. So I'll kind of break that open a little bit for you. So God has a plan. One of the things I do as a teacher, I teach at Sarah mentioned, at Neil McNeil High School. Anybody know Neil McNeil High School? Shout out to Neil. All right, it's a good place, and I'm really blessed to have the job, the vocation as a teacher, and to teach in this board. It's Toronto Catholic Board is I guess at this point the largest publicly funded Catholic board in the world, I believe. So it's kind of neat to still see that, because we go to other parts of Canada, we don't see that existence anymore. And teaching high school boys specifically is also a very unique experience in Scarborough, and it's definitely given me insight into my own life, because I went to Neil. When I first came to Canada and I went to school at St. Teresa's Shrine up there at Midland and Kingston Road, I ended up later on doing my internship as a teacher there, and then strangely enough getting a job at Neil McNeil that I went to in grade 9. And so it's kind of neat to come around full circle. One of the things I always talk to my students about at the beginning of the year, when we talk about your life and the orientation of your life and sort of the big questions, I always talk about the big questions of life, is I refer to what I call their backpack of truth. So we all kind of wear this backpack of truth. We're kind of born with, and we go through life. And when we're little, we're told, or we're not told, certain things about life, death, faith, and about God. And we put those things in our backpack. We store them there. And when we get into our teen years specifically, and I really believe that from my experience in chaplaincy and reflecting back on my own life, it's a process of sort of unpacking all that stuff that's in the backpack and looking at it again. And asking, what is the significance of these things that I've learned and been given in my life? How important are they for me at this stage in my development? And where do they fit into the big picture of what I'm called to do? And sometimes what I see with students and see with people, and I've done in my life, is throw some of that stuff out, right? Mom talks about God's existence, or I've had this experience of faith, and there's a tendency in our culture to say, well, if it's not relevant to me now, there's a tendency to kind of chuck it out. And, sometimes we don't perceive that we may need some of those things later on. Sometimes we may never even take anything out of the backpack, or sometimes they appear to be irrelevant to us. But I guess the question I'm always left with too is, why do we even begin to unpack the backpack? Why don't we just accept the way things are, or what it says, or what we've gathered in there? I think it's because we need to discover the meaning of these things in our journey for ourselves. And we begin to unpack the contents and check it and test it in our experience. That's why, if you ever work with teenagers or young kids, they test the boundaries, especially boys, always testing the boundaries. And that's okay, right? To do that. It's just sometimes they don't realize that crossing certain boundaries can lead to problems later on in life, or immediate problems. And so, how do we do that in our world today? Unpack these contents, and are the contents of the backpack of our society different than in years past? And I think discovering God's plan is not something static. It's something that happens over time, and it's as the late Viktor Frankl said, it's something that's ensuing. It's a process that we enter into. And if you ask me as a teenager, and I always say this too, it's three things I said I never do. One is teach, doing that. Two is teach religion, doing that. Three is get married, did that. And fourth was having kids, and I did that. And they've all, amazing experiences, but looking back at it from those years to now, it's quite a change in my perception of the world. So just a little bit about me, because Sarah, when we were talking about this, you said, you have a little bit of a story, so tell a little bit about your background. I was born in Trinidad in the 70s, I won't say when. I come from a very diverse cultural background, as Trinis are. It's a kind of a Caribbean soup, so to speak, of cultures and races. East Indian and Chinese and Scottish and African and Palestinian, and I keep adding other stuff every year when we find out there's more people in the extended family in the history. But having this diversity for me growing up allowed me to really experience different cultures and you could say the worldviews of different people. I celebrated things like Eid and Diwali with my neighbors and friends. It wasn't something foreign to the experience, although I knew that was not of my particular religion. I still experienced it as part of the culture, because wherever there's food, there's Trinidadians. That's where we show up for that kind of stuff. But I think I learned a lot about culture and faith. I realized later, I wasn't able to necessarily articulate it as a child, but through osmosis, right, of those relationships and having those kind of encounters, which I think is neat in Canada. I always look out in my classroom in Scarborough, and I look out and see it's like representative of every part of the world almost. And we're even taking a large number of international students, like students from China and who, in their experience from mainland China, most of them have never ever had the experience of organized religion. Like especially in the school setting, it's something that's very foreign to them, even conceptually. So that's really neat to see myself in that position today. But I think what I saw from the example of my mom and dad was, they had this strong set of Catholic values, and at the same time they had an appreciation, you could say, of the beauty of other worldviews. And so coming to Canada in the late 80s with my family, had the prospects of a new start and great opportunities. And many of us here represent families that come from, and even maybe you yourself, came as an immigrant to this country, so you can appreciate that. I see this in many of the stories of our high school students, and a reality for many of them, however, is when transitioning into a new country is hardship. One of the reasons we left Trinidad at the time was because of the growing instability. And at the time, we were beginning to see a real change in stuff like the underlying values and the politics and socially in the country. But upon arriving in Canada, my dad, who was 34 at the time, he fell ill. And this was, I'm talking within, realizing this when literally in weeks. He was always working. He had his own business. He was a mechanic. And he worked right up and really pretty much until the day before he left, when he passed the keys on to his foreman. And he used to complain a lot about headaches. But when you're young, and 30s is still young, he kept going. You know, he just kept pushing through and didn't really think anything of it. It'll pass. And when we got off the plane, I remember he complained a lot about dizziness and more headaches, which would be concerning. And about 3 months later, he was diagnosed with what's called astrocytoma, which is like, you know, I think they say the cells are shaped like stars, right? So it's a reference to astrocytoma, which is a type of brain tumor, which was cancerous, and he needed to begin rapid treatment. Now, we being new immigrants to the country didn't really understand the system, and that was quite tough, I think, getting adjusted to this whole new lifestyle. And, you know, even as a teenager, trying to fit in, make new friends, find your place, all that stuff that teenagers usually do, that was tricky. I always think of the student I had in you never know someone's story, right? So I teach sometimes this grade 12 open religion class, and some of the guys in there are real characters, right? School, let's just say school is not their number one priority, right? So, and but I kind of relate in some ways in my own history. So I'm glad to be with these guys. And there's one guy, he used to just come in and come into class. He would hand in his assignments and then he'd go to sleep. I'm like, well, I'm glad that we provide you a nice place to have a nap during fourth period. And every day it was the same thing. And, oh, sorry, sir, I'm just really tired. And sometimes you can approach people, and, you know, as a teacher, very, you know, let's see, not strict, but you know, we have to draw the line somewhere and try to figure out, okay, well, what's the problem? Why are you sleeping in my class? And he said, sir, I really try to get all the assignments done. I try to do that, but you know, my family, my mom is really ill, and my family has a cleaning business. So every night, you just get up, you know, go finish school. He actually used to play baseball. And he would go home and work in his family's cleaning business until 3 and 4 in the morning. And then come home and sleep and come back to school the next day. I'm like, it's okay, you can sleep in my class. That's okay. You won't tell anyone. But everyone has a story in that regard. And so I know when we're suffering in any way, one of the things that's shaken is often our faith and our hope. And when my dad began to recover, you were told to be kind of positive, and which we did. And I thought that was also a time for me as a boy, where you're getting to know your dad on a different level as you're transitioning as a teenager, right? When you're little, it's apparent to a child, but when you're a teenager getting to know your parents, you're seeing them in a different way because you're actually looking at fatherhood. Right? You're looking at their lives and asking questions about their own story. And it was tough to see him, you know, big, strong guy. Now, he would have these seizures, monthly seizures, and I would have to take care of him, and he'd be quite incapacitated by it. So to see him in that regard, too, also made him more vulnerable. And that was tough to watch for me. And I remember the day of his funeral, because he passed a couple of years after that. And I think it was the day for me as a young person that I began walking away from all of those values I talked about in the backpack, right? And I kind of put that stuff aside that I had been growing up with, and walking away from God, ultimately. And among the many questions about the why and the suffering and all that stuff that I struggled with, I think the biggest question for me was, you know, where do I fit in? And where's God in my life? And does God even have a plan for me as to where I'm going to end up? And in many ways, it's kind of like I consider it the fall from innocence. I see this in when I'm talking with people about what's going on in their lives. Many times we come to a place where there's this pivotal moment of pain or abandonment or betrayal or just suffering that we always kind of go back to. Each of us has one or two of those or more where it's sort of a pivotal experience in our life. And well, what began to change for me, I think later on in life as a teenager, was really a miracle. Like sometimes I look in my life and I wonder, how did I even get to this place, considering the way I used to see the world and how I was before. I don't really think it was me. Sometimes you feel like it's stuff that you did and you oriented yourself towards this career or whatever, but I really see how much God's grace, and I have seen how God's grace has been operative in my life, leading me to where I am today. And it's kind of like that Amazing Grace song. And I recall arguments that I would have with particular priests. When my mom would try to get me back to church, arguing with them. And this one priest that, I don't know if anybody went to University of Waterloo, like St. Jerome's. There you go. So there was a priest there, Father J.R. Finn. Now, long past, I think they've named a couple of wings after him. He's a brilliant mathematician. And my mom used to take me there to talk to him, and I would just go off on a whole bunch of random stuff. I didn't even understand what was coming out of my mouth. So he used to listen, and he'd be like, yes, Phil, I understand. And he would listen. Just shake his head. And I could go on for half an hour. And then what he would do, he had this amazing ability to take what I said and put it back to me. And so what you're saying is, in about 2 sentences. It's a brilliant mind. And he would put it back to me in a way that showed me the flaw in the logic that I was using too. It really, in 2 sentences, amazing. And I'd be like, oh yeah, okay, you're right. And so I could think of people like that in my life who were really pivotal. I think the Carmelite sisters of St. Joseph and St. Agatha were really, I wouldn't say just inspirational, but they really prayed for me and interceded for me. I had some encounters with them and many of my friends. And I think ultimately what I'm trying to say about this part of the talk is sometimes we forget that our own journeys and how we got to the places where we are in our life right now took a lot of time and patience. And I guess the question is, what opportunities afford us on a day-to-day basis to relate our faith to the other people, and how do we approach them in that? It's no easy task, and I think when we get into the question and answer period, those are some of the things that I'd like to discuss. The second aspect I wanted to discuss today was also this topic of do not be afraid, but to be, but to be cautious. That quote from John Paul II has always rang true to me about, at the outset of his papacy, he spoke to the church and he said, do not be afraid. And I think the popes from John Paul and even before have echoed that, where we need to figure out new ways in the changing climate and the changing culture of how to articulate our faith in the modern world and how to present it to people that we meet. I think I thought about this a lot, and it kind of confused me because there's so many things that you can talk about. But I wanted to give sort of an analogy that I think of when it comes to encountering people with the gospel message, but also in their own experiences. So I call it like an analogy of ministry, where there's like a tension between two worlds. Okay, you following me on this one? It's a little philosophical. Follow me on this one. So there's a tension between two worlds. So on the one hand, if you can imagine in your mind's eye, there's a city, and on the other side there's a vast ocean. So the city represents what I call order, right? So what we would know as order, in some ways that's the church. Well, in many ways that's the church. It's God's order, God's structure and teaching present in the world, the kingdom of God here on earth. And with structure and order, it's very beautiful, and it contains the keys to civilization and to truth. And the question I always ask with that order, though, because it is beautiful and it is perfect, It's if this is the image that people see, then how will they relate to her message? Yes, she gives us something to strive for, but most of us, most people, at least the people that I encounter on a day-to-day basis, don't live in that order. Right? So it seems sometimes exclusive or unreachable for many people. And I encounter this not just with students, but also with people that I work with. Questions about, where do I fit in, and how do I fit into this church, because I'm going through these particular things, or I have this type of lifestyle. And I think it's a very valid question. And while carrying the tension, so the other side of the tension, so you have the city, okay, remember that? So that's a place of order. Other side is that of the ocean. And as you get closer to the ocean, as you move closer to it, the tides of the ocean draw you in. And the ocean is what I call the chaos of uncertainty. So there's a lot of anxiety there, and possibly hopelessness, the deeper that you go into it, because there's no ground to stand on, and there's no way to sometimes see the edge. It's vast and endless, and it destroys. The older I get, the more I am sure that there's such a thing as evil in the world, both physically and spiritually, and that seeks to destroy. So sometimes this is what people are going through and experiencing on a day-to-day life, in their day-to-day life. How do we approach this ocean of chaos ourselves without getting sucked into it? And it's I'm often discussing this with people. It's how do you engage the culture without becoming, and I'm not saying everything in culture is in our culture, in our Western society is foreign, but how do you engage it in a way that you don't begin to lose your values at the same time? And so you have this tension between the two things. I think while we carry those two parts, and we're moving between the two opposites, so to speak, we need to meet people, what I would say is in that place in the middle, and I call that the wilderness, okay, which kind of holds the ocean and the city together at the same time, and it meets people there. It's a place of encounter, so it's a place of transformation. And it's not an easy place at all, but it allows people to move from the chaos towards the city, and when they're ready. And it also keeps them away from chaos, which can destroy them. So I guess a question for all of us is, where do we meet people, and when do we meet people in the chaos, and how do we find ourselves there, and how do we lead people to the places of transformation? I think on a daily basis we have to ask ourselves, am I good for time? Sorry. I think on a daily basis you have to ask yourself what you're called to do. I think the world we live in today is very career-minded, a very career-minded world. And yes, we have to work and to eat. Okay, we go to work, but at the same, we get an education to get a job and to be compliant members of our society in the suburban dream. But is that all that there is? What happens often is sometimes we achieve our goals, and we're left feeling that there's something missing or something more. And I guess the question ultimately is, what are we called to do? What are we called to do in the daily grind of our experiences and our encounters with other people? And I guess simply that's the place for me where I see God working in a very tangible way in the day-to-day experiences and the day-to-day interactions. I know that for me, at times, it's difficult, even working within Catholic schools or within a Catholic organization, to even speak about the faith in a very direct manner. And constantly as a teacher and as a chaplain, I'm having to find new ways to articulate that. But a lot of times what I find myself having to do is to really put my beliefs, I would say put them aside, but to really listen to where people are coming from and begin to welcome a dialogue from that. So that's something that I encourage you today to do today. So we did have some questions, okay, that I wanted you to discuss. Yeah, they're right here. Okay, so they're going to bring those around, and we're going to have an opportunity for you to talk about those. I think, and there's more food coming, right? There's more food coming, and you have an opportunity to talk about some of these things, and then we'll get back together for a larger group discussion.
Okay, so if we can just thank Phil for his talk.
I'll keep talking later.
And so we're going to invite him up in a bit, again, for question and answers. But like he said, there's questions that are coming around to your tables. With good old Catholic hospitality, make sure that you are including everyone around you, and feel free to discuss the questions on the page relating to the talk. And there's also, Phil, you want to talk a little bit about the prayer behind the page?
Oh, yes. Where is the page, actually?
Oh.
I'll go over the questions. So I'll just kind of read the questions over, and I think it's a point of discussion. I think one of the things I wanted to because this was sort of a vast topic in my mind, I wanted to give the opportunity to talk about a few things amongst yourselves, because many of you are out in the workforce or out engaging within an academic institution, and it's neat when you have all kinds of people with different experiences together. Really, a question is well, how have you seen God present in our secular world, and how have you experienced Christ in the encounters with people in your day-to-day experiences, whether that be at home or at school or at work? Second question, or I guess to discuss, is what are the challenges that you have in that way, and how have you dealt with those challenges of living your Catholic faith in the secular world? How have you been challenged to grow in your faith as well, in understanding the particular situations of others? And I just gave you a few quotes to discuss. And I know you guys, some of you may have heard of this, but on the back, I did put a prayer if you did want it, take it home. I'm sure you could find it online as well. But for Mother Teresa, or of Mother Teresa, it's something that I do actually use this prayer regularly. She, for me, has become a sort of that a representation of that modern day saint, where one of the things that she experienced quite heavily, I don't know if you've read anything about the life of Mother Teresa, was a type of, I guess you would say, separation from God, right? Like feeling that, like if you use the analogy of the ocean, Mother Teresa felt in many ways, I would say, anxiety, and went through a significant period of they call it in the spiritual life the dark night, and depression, separation from God. So we often think of her as this, super saint, where she was able to get out there and do all these great things, but at the same time, inside, she was experiencing turmoil, right? Her own interior turmoil, but yet she was still able to move forward. So I always look to her for intercession. So that's why I provided that for you.